Cora Hayes had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. The azure river valley, with its endless sky and whispering pines, had been both her cradle and her catechism, teaching her lessons of resilience in its scorching summers and unforgiving winters. But this lesson was different. This was a lesson in finality, taught by the bite of a rope and the suffocating weight of a blizzard that sought to erase her very existence. She hung from the thick, low-hanging branch of a great pine, a strange, broken ornament against the canvas of swirling white. The cold had moved past pain into a profound and terrifying numbness, a slow creep of ice through her veins that was stealing the last of her memories, the last of her fight. Her arms, tied cruelly behind her back, had long since lost all feeling. Her bare feet, dangling just above the snow-covered ground, were no longer her own. All that remained was the rhythmic agony in her neck and the rasp of a crude wooden sign against her back, its hateful message a final brand upon her soul. Wasteland Bride. The words were a mockery, a twisted epitaph for a life that had dared to dream of a love the valley could not sanction. The storm was a living thing, its howl a chorus of 1,000 angry spirits. But inside Cora's fading consciousness, a different storm raged. The memory of the past hours returned not as a clear narrative, but as splintered, jagged shards of trauma. She saw faces, faces she had known since childhood, now contorted into masks of righteous fury. These were the men of Redemption Gulch, men she had shared bread with, men whose children she had watched grow. Now, their eyes held no recognition, only the cold, hard certainty of the mob. They had dragged her from her small cabin without a word of trial, their verdict already delivered in the court of rumor and fear. Leading them was Jedediah Thorne, the heir to the valley's largest ranch. His face, usually handsome, made ugly by a triumphant sneer. It was his voice that had cut through her pleas, his hand that had pointed to the pine tree, his cruel laughter that had rung out as they hoisted her up. He was the conductor of this symphony of hate, but he was not the instrument of her deepest wound. That agony came from a sound, a simple, familiar jingle that had shattered the last remnants of her world. Through the swirling snow and the flickering torchlight, she had seen a figure lingering at the edge of the mob, a shadow of a man cloaked in shame. She couldn't see his face, but she heard it. The faint, rhythmic clink of his spurs. Her father's spurs. The sound that had once meant safety. The sound of his return home after a long day. Was now the soundtrack to her murder. That was the betrayal that had truly broken her. The final push into the abyss of surrender. Her head slumped forward, her breath a shallow, barely visible cloud in the freezing air. This was it. The end of the line. The valley she loved would be her tomb. The snow her shroud. She closed her eyes, ready for the final silence, for the cold to claim its prize. But then, a new sensation. Not the wind, not the rope, but a gentle, insistent tugging at the frozen hem of her dress. It was soft, inquisitive, and startlingly alive. Through eyelashes heavy with ice, Cora forced her eyes open one last time. A shape had emerged from the blizzard, a creature of smoke and shadow. It was a wolf, or perhaps a dog, larger than any she had ever seen, its thick coat the color of a winter storm cloud. Its eyes, two pools of intelligent gold, were fixed on her, holding not the wild hunger of a predator, but something else, something akin to recognition, to concern. This was Scylla. The name surfaced from a deep, forgotten part of her mind, a memory of a different time, a different life. The great beast whined softly, a low, mournful sound, and nudged her frozen legs again, as if trying to wake her from this terrible nightmare. When she didn't respond, the wolf dog grew more desperate, It paced beneath her, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. It looked up at her, then back towards the direction of the distant mountains, a silent question in its gaze. Receiving no answer, it did the only thing it could. It lifted its great head to the heavens, and from deep within its chest, a howl erupted. It was not a sound of aggression, but a long, sorrowful, piercing cry of loss and desperation. A note of pure loneliness that sliced through the storm's fury and echoed across the desolate, snow-draped landscape. It was a prayer sent into the void, a final, desperate call for a miracle, and the void answered. For a long time, there was nothing but the wind. Cora's hope, briefly kindled, flickered and died. But then, through the relentless white, another shape began to form. It was distant at first, a dark smudge on the horizon, but it grew steadily closer, resolving into the silhouette of a rider on a powerful horse, moving with a purpose that defied the storm. The rider was not from Redemption Gulch. His posture was different, his connection to the horse more innate. He rode as if he were a part of the land itself, not a conqueror of it. As he drew near, the wolf dog, Scylla, did not snarl or retreat. It stood its ground beside Cora, its tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the snow. The rider pulled his horse to a halt, his gaze taking in the scene in an instant: the hanging woman, the hateful sign, the stoic animal standing guard. His face was unreadable, carved from the same hard resilience as the mountains at his back, his eyes holding the ancient wisdom of the river tribe. He swung himself from the saddle, his movements fluid and sure. He approached without a word, his eyes meeting Scylla's for a brief moment of silent understanding. Then he looked up at Cora, and for the first time, she saw not judgment, not pity, but a spark of grim resolve. He did not hesitate. From a sheath at his belt, he drew a long, sharp knife. The blade gleamed for a second in the dim, gray light before he reached up. The sound of the rope being sliced clean was the loudest thing Cora had ever heard. A sudden, definitive severing of her bond with death. Her body, finally released, fell forward into the darkness. But she never hit the ground. Strong arms caught her, holding her with a strength that was both firm and gentle. The last thing she knew before the world faded entirely was the feeling of being lifted, of being saved. As the man named Rorik held her from the clutches of the storm, consciousness returned to Cora Hayes not as a sudden light, but as a slow, muddy tide rising through a deep and dreamless ocean. The first sensation was warmth, a profound, heavy heat that seemed to seep into her bones, an intimate contrast to the soul-deep memory of ice. The second was the scent of wood smoke, mingling with something else, something clean and herbaceous, like crushed sage and pine needles. It was the smell of healing, a fragrance so foreign to her senses after the metallic tang of fear that it was. For a moment, disorienting. She was no longer a broken ornament hanging in the heart of a storm. The wind's accusing howl had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic crackle of a nearby fire and the muffled, gentle sounds of a life being lived just beyond a thin barrier of hide. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy and swollen, blinking against a dim, orange-hued light that danced across the curved ceiling of the lodge. She was lying on a bed of thick, layered furs, bison and elk, their texture softer than anything she had ever known. She was inside a circular dwelling, its structure of bent willow and tightly stretched skins forming a protective womb against the harsh world outside. A woman sat by the fire, her back to Cora, her hair, woven into two long, gray-streaked braids that fell almost to her waist, glinted in the firelight. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her hands, weathered and wise, stirring something in a cast-iron pot that sent clouds of fragrant steam into the air. This was Lena, Though Cora did not yet know her name, she only knew that the hands that had treated her wounds were impossibly gentle, their touch speaking of a knowledge that ran deeper than memory, a language of herbs and ancient remedies. When Lena turned, her face was a beautiful map of her years, its lines etched by sun, sorrow, and wisdom. Her eyes, the color of hammered copper, held no pity or mercy for which Cora was grateful, only a calm, assessing gaze that seemed to look past the broken surface to the flickering ember of life within. She brought a shallow wooden bowl of steaming broth to Cora's lips. Cora drank, not from trust, but from a primal, desperate command from her own body. Her throat was raw, and the simple act of swallowing was an exercise in agony. Yet the warm, savory liquid was the first true comfort she had known in what felt like a lifetime. Her body was a vessel of pain. The rope had left a brutal, raw garland of chafed skin and deep bruises around her neck, and every muscle screamed in silent protest. In those first days, she was a wounded animal, accepting sustenance from a stranger while her soul remained coiled and defensive, ready to lash out at any perceived threat. Their silent ritual became the new rhythm of her existence. Lena would tend the fire, her movements economical and serene. She would grind herbs in a stone mortar, the rhythmic thudding a strangely soothing sound, and apply the dark, fragrant poultices to Cora's neck and wrists. She offered food and potent teas that eased the pain and pulled Cora into deep, restorative sleeps. She rarely spoke, allowing the silence to be a medicine in itself. Her constant, grounding presence a bulwark against the shifting chaos of Cora's mind. There was another guardian in the lodge, a silent, watchful shadow, the great wolf dog, Sela. Rarely strayed from the fireside, it would lie with its massive head resting on its paws, its golden eyes. Intelligent and unnervingly perceptive, tracking Cora's every slight movement. When she thrashed in the grip of a nightmare, whimpering names that had no faces, it would rise without a sound and move closer. Its immense, warm body a solid wall against the encroaching terrors. Its presence a silent reassurance until the fevered dreams passed. Cora felt a strange, untethered connection to the beast, a flicker of familiarity in the deep. Fog shrouded recesses of her mind, but the link was too fragile to grasp. She was a stranger in this sacred place, a guest of circumstance, and these two beings were her keepers, one human and one wild, both watching her with an unnerving, patient intensity that left her feeling both protected and profoundly exposed. The man who had saved her, Rorik, remained a ghost. She would see him only as a fleeting silhouette at the lodge's entrance, a dark, broad-shouldered shape against the harsh, brilliant light of the snow-covered world. He would leave bundles of dry firewood or a freshly dressed rabbit, his offerings placed just inside the hide flap before he disappeared as silently as he arrived. He never crossed the threshold completely, as if an invisible line had been drawn that he could not, or would not, breach. His was a presence defined by a deliberate absence, a cold draft that spoke of a deep and uncrossable chasm. He had pulled her from the jaws of death, an act of warrior's honor his spirit could not refuse. But having her here, in the sanctuary of his mother's lodge, was a different kind of trial. Her pale face and the scent of the white man's world that clung to her were a constant, painful reminder of his lost brother. Kaelin, to Rorik, she was the embodiment of the smiling, hand-shaking people from Redemption Gulch. The very people who had lured his brother to a peace talk that had been a bloody ambush 5 years prior. Her very breath, the life he had saved, was a testament to a world that had taken everything from him. And the resentment in his heart was a bitter, ever-present poison he struggled to contain. He found himself watching the lodge from afar, his heart a battlefield of conflicting duties, the duty to his mother's guest, the duty to his tribe's code of honor, and the powerful. Grieving duty to the memory of his brother, Cora's past returned to her in feverish, violent fragments. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of torment, a gallery of fractured images. She would dream of a hidden canyon in the peak of summer, the air thick with the sweet scent of sun-baked lavender and pine. She would see Kalen's hands, strong and gentle, as he showed her which roots could soothe a fever. His voice a low, soothing murmur like the river that gave their tribe its name. His laughter would echo against the warm canyon walls, a sound she thought she would never hear again, a sound that now felt like a physical blow. Then the dream would sour with terrifying speed. The sunlit canyon would become dark and cold. The laughter replaced by a chilling silence. A new memory would surface, one of a different kind of loss, of a small, still body wrapped in cloth and a grief so immense it had no name. She would cry out in her sleep, a choked, desperate sound that caused Lena to stir and place a calming hand on her brow, and made Rorik, standing sentinel in the cold night, clench his jaw until his teeth ached. One afternoon, the fever broke as suddenly as a summer storm. The world swam back into sharp, painful focus. The edges no longer blurred by pain and confusion. With trembling muscles, Cora pushed herself into a sitting position. She sat watching Scylla as it slept by the fire, its massive chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, a patch of white fur above its right eye, shaped like a tiny, perfect crescent moon, caught the firelight. And suddenly, the splintered memories fused. The image was no longer a fragment, but a complete, breathtaking picture of the canyon after the rain. A tiny, shivering pup, all that was left of its litter, huddled against the cold body of its dead mother, her own hands, trembling as she offered it the last of her water from a cupped palm. The name she had whispered to it then, a name of hope in a time of absolute despair. Her own voice, when it came, was a raw, fragile rasp, a sound she barely recognized. "Scylla," she breathed. The wolf dog's ears twitched. Its golden eyes snapped open and locked with hers. It rose to its feet in a single fluid motion and moved to her side, a low, questioning whine rumbling in its chest. It knew the name. At that exact moment, Rorik pushed back the hide flap to enter the lodge, carrying a bundle of dried herbs for his mother. He stopped dead, his powerful frame frozen in the entrance. He had seen the beast's devotion, had witnessed its intelligence, but he had known it only as a wild, powerful spirit of the mountains that had appeared in the storm. He never imagined it had a name, let alone one spoken with such familiarity by this woman. Cora's gaze lifted from the wolf dog to meet his, seeing the raw shock and disbelief etched on his stoic face. She found the strength to give voice to the memory that had just returned to her. Her voice was halting, but clear. "I found him. 5 years ago," she whispered, her hand rising to tentatively touch the thick fur on Scylla's neck. In the Whispering Canyons, he was just a pup, starving. She took a shaky breath, her eyes clouding with a sorrow 5 years deep. It was not long after Kalen. She couldn't finish the sentence, the name a fresh wound in her throat. "I raised him. He was the last living thing I had of that place, of that time." Rorik stood motionless, the herbs forgotten in his hand, the cold mountain air swirling in around him. The carefully constructed wall of his resentment, built on the solid ground of her being a complete and dangerous outsider, crumbled into dust. This creature, this silent, powerful guardian that had saved her life and led him to her, was not a random act of nature. It was a living thread, a direct link to his brother's final days. A legacy that this woman from the town he hated, had unknowingly protected and preserved. The air in the lodge grew still, charged with the immense weight of this revelation. The chasm between them had not vanished, but for the first time, a fragile, trembling bridge had just been thrown across it. The silence that fell upon the lodge was heavier than the winter snow blanketing the valley. It was a silence born of revelation, a vacuum where years of hatred and misunderstanding had just been vaporized. Rorik stood frozen in the entrance, the cold mountain air swirling around his powerful frame, his face a mask of stone through which a storm of conflicting emotions raged. The name, Scylla, spoken in this woman's broken voice, had reconfigured the entire landscape of his grief. The wolf dog, his brother's last living link to the world, had been cared for by the very person whose people he blamed for that loss. The irony was a cruel, sharp-edged stone in his gut. Lena, his mother, watched them both from her place by the fire, her copper eyes missing nothing, her wisdom telling her to let the silence do its work. Finally, Rorik moved. He let the hide flap fall closed, shutting out the harsh white world and enclosing the three of them. And the wolf dog, in the warm, fire-lit intimacy of the lodge. He did not speak immediately, but walked to the fire and added a log, the action deliberate, buying him a moment to reorder his world. He crouched, staring into the flames, his back to Cora. The tension was a living thing, a fourth presence in the room. He had rescued a woman from Redemption Gulch, an enemy. Now he found himself the protector of his brother's memory keeper. The two realities could not coexist. One had to yield. "The day before we found you," he began, his voice low and rough, not turning around. A map was posted in the saloon in Redemption Gulch. He described the scene not as a report, but as a memory he was reluctantly reliving. The stink of stale whiskey and wet wool, the angry, rumbling voices of ranchers and prospectors, the way the yellow lamplight gleamed on the barrel of a holstered pistol. He painted a picture of Jedediah Thorne standing on a crate, his voice full of feigned outrage, holding up a piece of surveyor's parchment for all to see. Thorne claimed he had found it tucked into the door of the land office. A brazen and cowardly claim. The map, Rorik explained, detailed a small, fertile plot deep within the Whispering Canyons. It was a place the tribe held as sacred, a place settlers were meant to avoid. The claim was staked clearly under a name, Cora Hayes. "It was your name," Rorik said, finally turning to look at her, his eyes searching her face for the lie he had been so sure he would find. But it was not the land claim that drove them to madness. It was what the map showed next to it. He paused, his voice dropping even lower. A small shaded square, marked only as unmarked grave. At first, Cora's mind, still fragile, struggled to grasp the words. A map. A land claim. It was nonsense. She had never commissioned a survey, never sought to own a piece of the earth she had only ever wished to live peacefully upon. But then he said the words, unmarked grave, and the world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. The warmth of the lodge vanished, replaced by an internal ice age, a cold so profound it dwarfed the memory of the storm. The fever dreams, the fragmented images of a small bundle wrapped in cloth, of her own hands, raw from digging in the hard earth, coalesced into a single, searingly clear memory. Her child, her tiny, breathless child, whom she had buried alone in the silence of the canyon, with only the whispering pines as witnesses. A strangled sound escaped her lips. This was the reason she had been traveling, the reason she had risked getting so close to Redemption Gulch. A rumor had reached her, carried by a sympathetic trapper, that Thorne's men were pushing into the canyons, and she had been overcome by a desperate, primal need to ensure his resting place remained undisturbed. She hadn't been claiming land, she had been trying to protect a memory. And that memory, the most sacred and painful secret of her life, had been twisted into a weapon against her, used by Thorn to paint her as a greedy, land-stealing intruder. The grief that had been her constant, silent companion for 5 years was suddenly consumed by a firestorm of pure, righteous rage. The passivity that had clung to her like a shroud in the days of her recovery burned away. The wounded animal was gone. In its place was a mother whose cub had been threatened. A new strength flooded her limbs. She pushed herself fully upright, her eyes, once dull with pain, now blazing with a cold. Hard light. "Take me there," she said. Her voice no longer a whisper but a command, low and unwavering. Now. Rorik saw the transformation, and in that moment, the last vestiges of his resentment turned to ash. This was not the face of a deceitful settler. This was the face of a woman defending her heart, a warrior in her own right. The truth of her story was written in the fire in her eyes. "We will go at dawn," he said, his voice now devoid of its earlier conflict. It was a simple statement of fact. A vow. The journey to the Whispering Canyons began under a sky the color of slate. Lena packed provisions, dried meat, journey cakes, and a small pouch of herbs, pressing it into Cora's hands with a silent, meaningful look. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. Rorik prepared 2 horses, his movements efficient and filled with a new, focused energy. Cora, though still weak, moved with a steely determination that seemed to hold her fragile body together. As they rode out from the sheltered camp, Sela trotted ahead, a gray shadow against the snow, his role shifting from guardian to guide, leading them back to the place where all their histories, hopes, and sorrows converged. They rode for hours, the silence between them no longer one of animosity, but of shared purpose and unspoken grief. The landscape of the Azure River Valley unfolded around them, a majestic, indifferent witness to their small human dramas. They passed through silent forests of snow-laden pines and across vast, wind-scoured plains. Rorik would occasionally point out a landmark, a distant butte shaped like a sleeping giant, an ancient pictograph on a rock face sharing his world with her in small, quiet gestures. Cora, in turn, found herself seeing the land through 2 sets of eyes her own, and the memory of how Kaelin had seen it, a place of profound spiritual power and life. As they neared the entrance to the Whispering Canyons, the air grew still, the temperature seemed to drop, and a sense of foreboding settled over them. This was a place of deep memory for Cora, a sanctuary that had become a tomb. She could feel the ghosts of her past here, the echo of Kaelin's laughter and the weight of her own solitary sorrow. Sila, who had been trotting confidently, now slowed, his ears flattening slightly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He could sense the desecration before they could see it. They rounded a final bend of red rock, and the canyon opened up before them. Cora's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The sacred, secluded meadow she remembered was gone. It had been violated. The earth was scarred and torn. Where the small, carefully placed mound of stones had been, there was now only a flattened, muddy patch of disturbed ground, and rising from the earth like splintered bones were dozens of raw, wooden survey stakes, each branded with the crude T of Thorn's Cattle Company. They were laid out in an unnatural, aggressive grid, a cage of geometry forced upon a place that had only ever known the gentle curves of nature. "No," Cora whispered, the word a prayer of disbelief. She slid from her horse, her legs giving way beneath her as if their strings had been cut. She fell to her knees in the snow, her gaze fixed on the brutalized earth. This was more than a desecration, it was an erasure. They had not just disturbed a grave, they had tried to pretend it never existed. Sela moved to her side, whimpering and nudging the flattened earth where the grave had been. His own animal grief a heartbreaking echo of her own. Rorik dismounted, his face a thundercloud of cold fury, His hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, the knuckles white. The rage he felt now was clean, pure, and aimed directly at Jedediah Thorne. This was an attack not just on Cora, but on the sanctity of the land itself. An insult to the memory of the brother he had lost and the child this woman had buried here. He looked from Cora's kneeling, shattered form to the arrogant wooden stakes that polluted the landscape. In that moment, he understood with chilling clarity this was no longer about clearing a woman's name or correcting a past injustice. The fight had come to them, right here, right now. It was a physical battle for the soul of the canyon, a war against the men who believed they could own the earth by driving stakes into its heart. The sight of the desecrated earth stole the very breath from Cora's lungs, and with it, the fire of her rage in its place. A vast, hollow emptiness opened up, a grief so profound it had no sound. She knelt in the snow, her body trembling, her spirit shattered. The arrogant wooden stakes felt like nails driven directly into her heart, each one a monument to Thorne's cruelty and her own powerlessness. All the strength that had propelled her on this journey evaporated, leaving her a fragile husk. The world narrowed to the violated patch of ground, the ghost of a tiny grave, and the all-consuming silence of her loss. She was adrift in a sea of sorrow, deaf to the wind, blind to the world around her. Rorik stood over her, a mountain of contained fury. His first instinct was to ride back to Redemption Gulch and let his rage carve its own brutal justice. But seeing Cora, so completely broken, anchored him. Her pain was a mirror to his own long-nursed grief for Kaelin, and his purpose solidified. It was no longer about revenge, it was about protection. He laid a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that was both awkward and profoundly necessary. But she didn't respond. It was Scylla who acted, the great wolf dog, who had been whining softly. Suddenly lifted its head with purpose. It nudged Cora's hand insistently with its wet nose, then turned and trotted towards a sheer rock face at the back of the meadow, where a curtain of water from the high cliffs cascaded down into a churning pool, its roar a constant, powerful bass note in the canyon's symphony. Scylla disappeared behind the veil of the waterfall. For a moment, it was gone. Then, its head reappeared through the water, barking once a sharp, commanding sound that cut through Cora's stupor. It was in summons, an undeniable command to follow. Rorik. His eyes narrowed in thought, recognized the call for what it was a sign. Gently, he helped Cora to her feet, her movements slow and unsteady like those of an old woman. He guided her towards the thundering water, his arm a firm support around her. Stepping through the waterfall was like passing through a veil between worlds. The roar became deafening, the air thick with icy mist, and then, suddenly, they were in a space of impossible quiet. Standing at the mouth of a hidden cave, the air inside was cool and dry, and smelled faintly of dried herbs, earth, and time. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cascade, they saw they had stepped into a secret sanctuary. Shelves, painstakingly carved into the rock walls, were lined with clay pots and glass jars, each filled with dried leaves, roots, and flowers. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling like sleeping bats. A large, flat stone served as a workbench, a stone mortar and pestle resting beside it as if its owner had just stepped away. It was a place of peace, of knowledge, of healing. It was Kaelin's place. Cora's hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Being here, surrounded by the essence of the man she had loved and lost, was both a comfort and an almost unbearable agony. On the workbench, beneath a layer of fine dust, lay a leather-bound journal. Rorik approached it with a reverence he would have shown a sacred object. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he brushed the dust away and opened the cover. The pages were filled with Kalen's elegant, precise script. Rorik began to read aloud, his voice low and thick with emotion, and the cave filled with the ghost of his brother's voice. The first entries were about the land, observations of the seasons, detailed drawings of plants. He described teaching Cora how to find lavender, his words painting a picture of a time filled with light and love. Cora sank to the floor, listening, tears streaming silently down her face. Rorik's voice faltered as he turned to the final pages. The tone of the writing had changed. The joy was gone, replaced by a grim urgency. Something is wrong in the valley. He read, Thorn grows bolder. He speaks of the tribe as a blight to be cleansed. And the men in the saloon listen, their greed making them deaf to reason. He has called for a peace talk, but I fear it is a trap. His eyes hold no peace, only the glint of a drawn blade. Cora held her breath, the words confirming a suspicion she had harbored for 5 long years. He continued, reading the last entry Kalen ever wrote. I will go to the meeting, but I will not lead them to our people. I will lead them here, to this canyon. It is isolated, if it is a trap. The fight will end here, with me. It is a better fate than allowing their fire to reach the village. Tell Cora. Tell her the Whispering Canyon holds my heart. As she does, I will return to her. Rorik's voice broke on the last words. He closed the journal. The truth now laid bare between them. Kalen had not been ambushed out of carelessness. He had made a choice. He had sacrificed himself to save his people. His final thoughts on the woman he loved. The emotional weight of the revelation filled the silence of the cave, but that sacred quiet was brutally shattered. A shadow fell across the entrance, blocking the light filtering through the waterfall. Then another, and another. Cora looked up in terror to see the menacing silhouettes of several men. At their lead was Jedediah Thorn, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face as he saw them cornered. Well, well. Thorn's voice dripped with venom. Looks like the happy family is all here. I knew if I stirred up the dirt on this grave, I'd find the rest of the vermin. Rorik rose to his full height, placing himself between Thorn and Cora, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. This is between you and me, Thorn. He growled. Thorn simply laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. It was always bigger than you, he sneered, then nodded to one of his men. Burn it. Burn it all. Before they could react, the man tossed a lit torch into the dry brush and fallen pines at the canyon's narrow entrance. The flames, fed by the wind that funneled through the canyon, erupted with a terrifying roar, a wall of fire instantly sealing their only escape route. The heat was immense and thick. Acrid smoke began pouring towards the cave. Panic set in. They were trapped. The fire raged with an impossible speed, the canyon walls glowing like the inside of a furnace. Rorik coughed, his eyes streaming from the smoke, as he searched for any other way out, any crevice they could hide in. There was none. Cora huddled against the back wall, Silo whining and pressing against her, the roar of the fire a death knell in her ears. This was the end, a tomb of smoke and flame, just as despair was about to claim them. A new sound cut through the inferno, a shower of rocks clattering down from above. They looked up, high on the canyon wall, on a narrow, precarious ledge they hadn't seen before. A figure was moving. It was a silhouette against the raging fire, moving with an impossible speed and confidence along the treacherous path. Was it a spirit? A hallucination born of smoke and fear? The figure paused, and a gust of wind momentarily cleared the thickest of the smoke. For one heart-stopping second, the light of the fire illuminated him. He was leaner, harder, his face etched with scars that hadn't been there before. But it was him. It was Kalen. He was alive. The word was a silent scream in Cora's mind. Rorik stared, his face a mask of utter disbelief. Kalen raised an arm and pointed towards the back of the cave they were in. "There's another way." His voice was hoarse, raw, changed by time and hardship. But it was his voice. Behind the shelves, go now. The reunion, the 1,000 questions. The years of pain, all of it would have to wait. The fire was closing in, driven by a surge of adrenaline and a miracle they couldn't comprehend. Rorik grabbed Cora's arm and pulled her towards the back of the cave, as the flames licked at the entrance behind them. They scrambled into the darkness, running from the fire and towards the ghost who had just stepped out of the flames and back into their lives. The passage Kalen revealed was not a tunnel, but a fissure in the rock. A tight, dark space that smelled of damp earth and centuries of stillness. He moved into the blackness without hesitation, his body accustomed to the secret ways of the mountain. Rorik, pushing Cora gently ahead of him, followed, his broad shoulders scraping against the narrow walls. Sela pressed close behind, a reassuring furry presence in the suffocating dark. The roar of the fire faded behind them, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the soft scrape of their boots on stone. It was a journey through the belly of the earth, a blind passage from a world of flame and violence into an unknown future. For Cora, the darkness was a strange mercy, a sensory deprivation that forced her to rely on the one thing she thought she had lost forever, the feel of Kalen's hand as he guided her over the treacherous, unseen terrain. They emerged, blinking, into the twilight of a different part of the valley, high on a ridge overlooking the smoldering scar of the canyon below. The air was thin and cold, thick with the smell of ash and sorrow. The great fire had mostly burned itself out, leaving behind a blackened, skeletal landscape under a sky stained with smoke. They were alive. They were together. The adrenaline of the escape began to recede, leaving in its wake the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of trauma and the overwhelming weight of 5 years of unsaid things. In the eerie stillness, they truly looked at each other for the first time. Cora's gaze devoured Kalen. He was the man she loved, the man whose face was imprinted on her soul. Yet he was also a stranger. The gentle lines around his eyes had been replaced by a network of fine scars, one of which cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of fierce intensity. He was leaner, harder. The quiet healer replaced by a survivor who moved with the coiled, watchful energy of a predator. He looked at her, and his eyes, though hardened by hardship, still held the same deep, unwavering love she remembered, now mingled with an almost unbearable pain for what she had endured. He saw the new lines of grief on her face, the haunted look in her eyes, the raw, brutalized skin of her neck. An ocean of loss and time separated them, and the silence was filled with its roar. They found shelter in a small alcove of rock. Shielded from the wind, it was Kalen who spoke first, his voice the rough, gravelly sound of a man long accustomed to silence. He told them of the ambush. Just as his journal had said, he had been left for dead, a broken arrow shaft in his side. He was found days later, close to death, by a nomadic hunting party from a remote tribe that lived in the highest peaks. A people of myth to the valley dwellers. They had healed his body, but the news they brought him from the settlements had broken his spirit, a woman matching Cora's description. Driven mad with grief, had left the valley. He had believed it. He thought she was gone forever. To return, he reasoned, would only have put a target on the backs of his own people, inviting more of Thorn's violence. His absence had not been an abandonment, but a long, painful, and misguided exile meant to protect the very people he loved. When his story was finished, A heavy silence fell. Then, it was Cora's turn, with Rorik and Kaelin listening, their faces etched with a shared, somber attention. She spoke of the years that followed. She spoke of the crushing loneliness, the whispers in town, the slow death of hope. And then, her voice breaking into a fragile whisper, she told them the secret she had carried alone for so long. She told them of their child, a son, born frail in the heart of winter and gone before he could ever see a spring. She described holding his tiny, still body and burying him herself in the Whispering Canyon, the only sacred place she had left. The words hung in the cold air, a testament to the true depth of Thorn's cruelty, not just the theft of land, but the desecration of a mother's most sacred memory. Kaelin closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dust and grime on his cheek. The news struck him with a force greater than any physical blow. He had been grieving the loss of a future, while she had been enduring the loss of a life that had already been. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. A silent vow that she would never be alone in her grief again. Rorik watched his brother, his own heart aching with a complex mix of sorrow for their shared loss and a profound, healing relief. The ghost of his brother, the one he had mourned for 5 years, was gone. In his place sat a man of flesh and blood, scarred but alive. He moved to Kaelin's side and placed a hand on his shoulder. No words were needed. The 5-year chasm between the brothers was closed. In the shared catharsis of their stories, a new feeling began to take root, pushing up through the ashes of their grief. It was resolve. The thought of running, of disappearing into the mountains as Kaelin had done, was dismissed without being spoken. Their separate pains had been forged into a single, unbreakable weapon. They would not flee. They would return to Redemption Gulch. Not for vengeance, but for truth. They would face Thorn not as victims, but as survivors who carried the weight of the past and the unwavering strength of what they had endured together, as this new determination settled upon them. A sound from the rocks below startled them. Scylla rose with a low growl, but Kaelin quieted him with a soft word. A figure was cautiously approaching their makeshift camp, a man moving with the hesitant, shuffling gait of someone carrying a heavy burden. As he stepped into the faint light of their dying fire, Cora gasped. It was her father. He looked 10 years older than the last time she'd seen him. A stooped, broken man consumed by a guilt that had hollowed out his eyes. He couldn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. "I never thought he'd do it," he finally whispered, his voice cracking with shame. "I swear it. Cora, he said it was just to scare you off." He then told them his own story of coercion. Thorn had known of a secret debt, a youthful crime that would have meant ruin and prison for him. Thorn had used that secret to blackmail him, to force his silence, his complicity. "He made me a coward," her father choked out, tears finally falling. "But I will not die one." From inside his coat, he pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was thick, its pages filled with neat columns of names and numbers. "This is his," he said, holding it out to Cora. "His private business ledger, it has everything: the fraudulent land purchases, the payments to the men who lied for him, the true survey lines that show his ranch has been encroaching on tribe land for years. The map he used against you. It's all part of this. This book is the truth." Cora looked at her father, the man whose betrayal had wounded her so deeply. She saw no malice in his eyes, only a pathetic, desperate plea for forgiveness. Without a word, she took the ledger. Its weight felt real, solid, a tangible weapon against Thorn's lies. Her father nodded once, a silent thank you, and then turned and melted back into the twilight. A ghost seeking his own kind of redemption. Cora. Kaelin. and Rorik stood in the gathering darkness, the book in her hands. Their path suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The dawn that broke over the Azure River Valley found Cora Hayes standing on a high bluff. The world spread out beneath her like a map of her own heart, scarred, but resilient. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the faint, clean scent of burned pine from the canyon, a strangely purifying aroma. The rising sun promised a new beginning, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. She was not alone. Kalen stood beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth that anchored her to the present. Rorik was there too, his gaze watchful and steady, and with them was Lena, her serene face a testament to an unshakable faith in the turning of the seasons. Below them, the town of Redemption Gulch lay sleeping, still shrouded in the long shadows of the mountains and its own corrosive secrets. They had not come for revenge. Vengeance was a fire that consumed everything, and they had seen enough of fire. They had come bearing the heavy weight of the truth. As the sun climbed higher, casting its impartial light, life began to stir. Smoke curled from chimneys, and figures emerged onto the main street, their movements slow in the morning chill. Soon, heads turned and fingers began to point up at the small, stoic group on the bluff. A crowd began to gather, a slow, cautious assembly drawn by a potent mixture of curiosity, fear, and a dull, collective guilt. They murmured amongst themselves, the sound drifting up to the watchers on the wind, like the buzzing of agitated bees. Then, a single figure detached himself from the crowd and began the slow, arduous walk up the path. It was Cora's father. His face was pale, but his back was straight for the first time in years. He came to stand beside his daughter, his public act of penance a silent signal to the town that a reckoning was at hand, with the crowd now watching in tense, expectant silence. He spoke, his voice, though hoarse, carried in the clear air, each word a stone dropped into a still pond. He confessed his cowardice, his weakness, and the way Jedediah Thorne had used his secrets to curdle his soul and force his complicity. He spoke not to excuse his actions, but to lay them bare. When he finished, Cora stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She simply held up the heavy leather ledger for all to see, its presence a silent, irrefutable fact. "This book holds the truth of this valley," she said, her voice calm and clear. "It does not speak of my pain, but of a web of deception. It speaks of how one man's greed was allowed to poison the well from which you all drink, turning neighbor against neighbor, truth into lies." A furious roar erupted from the crowd as Jedediah Thorne pushed his way to the front, his face a mask of purple rage. "Lies!" he bellowed, his eyes wild. "She is a half-breed lover and a thief. The word of this woman and a disgraced old man is worthless. Are you going to let these outsiders defile our town with their filth?" He tried to ignite the familiar fire of the mob, his words the same venomous fuel he had used before. Some in the crowd surged forward, their faces hardening once more into the cruel masks Cora remembered. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the fragile peace would shatter into violence. But before Thorne's poison could take full effect, another man stepped forward. It was Sheriff Miller, an older, quiet man whom many had long underestimated. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his hand held up to quell the crowd. He stopped in front of Thorne. "I think we've heard enough from you, Jedediah," the sheriff said, his voice surprisingly firm. He gestured towards the ledger. "This book, along with the testimony of several men you paid to lie for you, tells a different story. A story of fraud, conspiracy, and the attempted murder of Cora Hayes." Thorne lunged, but the sheriff was faster than he looked, in a swift, decisive movement. He had Thorne's arm pinned behind his back. "You're under arrest," he stated. Some of Thorne's most ardent supporters, seeing the sheriff's unyielding resolve, hesitated and then melted back into the crowd, their bravado evaporating. The town was left in a state of fractured shock. Some stared at the ground in shame. Others glared up at the bluff with impotent fury. Justice had come, but it was a fragile, bitter thing. While the sheriff dealt with Thorne, Cora walked down from the bluff, the crowd parting for her as if she were a ghost returning to her own haunting. Rorik followed, carrying the crude, hateful sign they had taken from the canyon. She walked through the silent sea of faces, some averted in shame. Others hardened with resentment until she reached the town's main notice board, with a hammer that Rorik provided. She took a nail. This was not an act of anger, but of reclamation. As she hammered the nail, each loud, deliberate strike was a declaration. The first strike was for her lost child. The second was for Kaylin's stolen years. The third was for the truth. And the final strike was for herself. For the woman who was supposed to die but had refused. She fastened the Wasteland Bride sign to the board, placing it in the center of their town. A permanent, unignorable monument to their sin and her survival. Their work was done, without a backward glance. Cora, Kaylin, Rorik. And Lena turned and walked away. They left Redemption Gulch to reckon with its own soul, to live with the ugly truth they could no longer deny. Their path led them back towards the high peaks, towards the quiet embrace of the whispering canyons. The final scene is not one of triumphant celebration, but of quiet, hopeful work. Days later, in the scarred but recovering canyon, the four of them, with Scylla at their side, move across the blackened earth. The fire had taken much, but it had not taken the spirit of the place. The river still flowed, and life, tenacious and stubborn, was returning. They are replanting. Kaylin, with Lena's guidance, shows Cora and Rorik how to place the roots of sacred herbs back into the soil, their hands working together in a shared, silent rhythm. Their victory was not in the town below, but here, in the patient, healing work of their own hands. They had not won back a piece of land through law, they were reclaiming it through love, through their presence, through the quiet promise to be its caretakers. The sun filters through the canyon, illuminating the new, tender green shoots pushing up through the ashes. A new life, born of fire and loss, was beginning, not with a roar of victory, but with a whisper of hope. It was their own quiet, hard-won dawn,